He should have left the man in the dust. But by sunrise, he would understand exactly what that choice cost him. Now before we go on, tell me where you're watching from. And if you believe kindness still matters out here, stay with me. Because this one doesn't end the way you think. The road stretched empty for miles under a pale western sky, nothing but wind, dry grass, and the slow rhythm of a horse that had seen too many miles and asked too few questions. Ethan Cole rode, without hurry, hat low, shoulders heavy, the kind of man the land forgets but never breaks, until he saw it. A shape in the distance where no shape should be. A man lying half-turned in the dirt beside a shattered wagon wheel. The kind of stillness that usually meant the story was already over. Ethan slowed, not out of concern, but habit. Out here, hesitation kept you alive longer than kindness ever did. The wind carried no voices, no movement, just silence, thick and waiting. He could have ridden past. Most men would have. Most men did. But then the man's hand twitched, barely, like something inside him refused to give up just yet. Ethan exhaled slow through his nose, boots hitting the ground with a dull thud as he stepped closer, revolver hanging loose at his side. Not drawn, not needed, not yet. The man wore clothes that didn't belong to this land. Clean lines, fine stitching, now ruined by dust and time. His fingers still gripped a leather satchel like it was the only thing that mattered, tighter. Then a man holds water in the desert. Ethan crouched, studying him the way you study a storm before deciding if it's worth riding into. The man's breathing was shallow but steady, not dying, not yet. Wrong road. Ethan muttered under his breath, more to the wind than the stranger, but he didn't turn away, didn't step back. Instead, he slid one arm under the man's shoulders and pulled him up, slow, careful, like lifting something that might break without warning. The horse shifted behind him, leather creaking, dust rising in soft clouds around their boots. The sun dipped lower, painting everything in that quiet gold that comes right before the cold sets in. Ethan didn't ask who he was, didn't ask where he came from. Out here, names didn't change much, actions did. And this one was simple. Keep him breathing. Nothing more. The cabin sat a mile off the road, weathered wood and a crooked door that never quite shut all the way. Inside, the air smelled like old smoke and dry timber. Ethan laid the man down on a narrow cot, poured a splash of water into a tin cup, tilted it carefully to the stranger's lips. Easy, he said, voice low, steady, not kind, not cruel. Just there, the man coughed. Once, then again, eyes flickering open just long enough to show something sharp behind them, something that didn't match the weakness in his body. And that was the first thing that felt wrong. Not the satchel, not the clothes, but the way he looked at Ethan like he was measuring him. Even now, even like this, night settled and slow, wind pressing against the cabin walls like it had something to say, but didn't know how. Ethan sat by the fire, silent, watching the flames move, listening to the man's breathing even out behind him. Time passed the way it always did out here, unnoticed until it mattered. Then the man spoke, voice quiet, but clear enough to cut through the room. You ever lose something that was yours? Ethan didn't turn right away, just stared into the fire, jaw tightening slightly. The kind of question that doesn't belong to strangers. Not out here. Not in a place where answers cost more than silence. Finally, he said nothing, because sometimes saying nothing was the only answer worth giving. The man let out a faint breath, almost like a laugh, almost like regret, and the fire crackled between them, steady, patient, like it already knew how this would end. Outside, the night stretched wide and empty, but somewhere far off, too far to hear yet, something was already moving toward them, something that would arrive with the morning. And when it did, Ethan Cole would realize the man he pulled from the dust wasn't just a stranger. He was a debt waiting to be called. Morning did not arrive with light first. It arrived with sound, low at the edge of hearing, steady and deliberate, the kind of sound that does not belong to chance. Ethan Cole was already awake when it reached him, sitting in the same chair by the dying fire, hat still low, eyes open but unmoving. A man who had learned long ago that sleep never came easy when something felt unfinished. The stranger behind him had not spoken again through the night. Not a word, not a question, just quiet breathing that never quite settled into rest. And that was the second thing that felt wrong. Men who nearly died usually slept like they had earned it. This one did not. Ethan rose slowly, boots pressing against the wooden floor with a soft creak, his hand brushing past the table where the leather satchel still rested, untouched, exactly where the man had kept it within reach even in sleep. Ethan glanced at it once, then away, not out of fear, but out of something older, something closer to principle. You do not take what a man protects unless you are ready to become something else. Outside, the air carried that early chill that settles into the bones before the sun decides to show itself. The horizon still gray, still undecided. And there it was again, clearer now, hoofbeats, not hurried, not scattered, but even, measured, like men who knew exactly where they were going and exactly what they would find when they got there. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, one hand resting lightly near his side, not reaching, not tense, just aware. The land stretched out wide before him, dust lying flat, wind holding its breath. And then the shapes appeared, first one, then three, then more, riders, cresting the far ridge in a line too clean to be coincidence. Their horses moved without hesitation, without drift, closing the distance with the kind of patience that does not need to rush. Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly, counting without meaning to, 10, maybe more behind them. Their silhouettes steady against the growing light. No raised voices, no sudden movements, just presence, heavy and controlled, like a storm that had already decided where it would land. He did not move from the porch, did not call out, because something in the way they rode told him words would not matter yet. Behind him, the cabin door opened with a quiet scrape. The stranger stepped out, not leaning, not faltering. The weakness from the night gone like it had never existed. His coat straightened, his posture clean, eyes sharp in a way that no man freshly pulled from the dirt should be. Ethan did not turn fully, just enough to see him in the corner of his gaze. And that was the third thing that felt wrong. The way the man looked at the riders, not with fear, not with relief, but with expectation, like a man waiting for something that belonged to him to arrive. The riders came to a stop about 30 yards out, their horses settling into stillness as one, dust lifting slowly around them before falling back to the ground. None of them spoke. None of them reached for anything. They simply waited, and waiting like that took more control than any threat ever could. Ethan felt it then, not fear, but weight, like the ground beneath him had shifted without moving. The stranger stepped forward past him, boots quiet on the worn wood. And for the first time since the night before, his voice came again. No strain, no weakness, just calm, measured. "You keep your place well, Mr. Cole," he said, and Ethan's eyes sharpened at the name, because he had not given it, not once, not in word, not in hint, and the riders out there did not react, not a glance, not a shift, like they had already known who stood on that porch before they ever arrived. The man reached into his coat slowly, deliberately, not to threaten, not to hide, but to retrieve something folded, worn at the edges from use, and Ethan did not need to see it clearly to feel what it was. The shape alone carried weight, memory, something tied to nights longer than this one, to landlines and signatures and promises that never felt like his to begin with. The stranger held it between his fingers for a moment, not offering it yet, just letting it exist in the space between them as the sun finally broke over the ridge, casting light across the riders, across the dust, across Ethan Cole standing still on his own land. And in that light, everything that had felt quiet suddenly felt seen. The stranger looked at him then, fully, no pretense left, no weakness to hide behind. "Funny thing about debts," he said softly. "They have a way of finding their way home." And Ethan did not reach for his gun, did not step back, did not say a word, because somewhere deep under the dust and the years, he already understood that whatever had ridden in with the morning was never just about the man he saved. It was about everything that came with him, everything that had been waiting longer than a single night to be settled. The paper did not move in the wind, even though everything else did. Not the dust, not the hem of the man's coat, not the loose strands of Ethan Cole's sleeve. It stayed perfectly still between his fingers like it carried its own weight, its own gravity, and Ethan knew that kind of weight, not by sight, but by memory, the kind that comes stamped with ink and law and men who never set foot on the land they claim. He did not reach for it, did not ask to see it, because something in his chest had already tightened in recognition. The riders behind the man remained quiet, their presence pressing against the air like a held breath. No one shifted, no one whispered. Even the horses seemed to understand that this moment belonged to something larger than movement. The man stepped down from the porch, boots meeting the dirt with a calm that did not belong to chance. And for a second, he looked out across the land as if measuring it, not admiring it, not questioning it, but confirming something already known. Then he turned back to Ethan and unfolded the paper slowly, careful, deliberate, letting the edges catch the morning light. And there it was, not in full detail, not yet, but enough, a seal pressed deep into the corner, a mark Ethan had seen before, on notices nailed to posts, on letters slipped under doors, on documents that turned homes into numbers and lives into accounts. Ethan's jaw shifted slightly, not anger, not fear, just the quiet adjustment of a man who had just found the missing piece to something he never wanted to understand. The man held the paper out halfway between them, not offering it, not pulling it back, just letting it exist where it could not be ignored. "You recognize it," he said, not a question, not an accusation, just a statement spoken like fact. Ethan did not answer. Because out here, words did not change truth, they only delayed it. The wind picked up slightly, brushing past the riders, stirring the edges of coats and reins, but still, no one moved. The man's eyes stayed on Ethan, steady, patient, like a man who had waited a long time for something simple to finally align. "I suppose I should thank you," he continued, his tone even, almost polite, but there was something underneath it, something measured, something that did not belong to gratitude alone. Not many would have stopped. Ethan finally spoke then, voice low, dry from disuse. "Not many ride this road." It was not defiance, not agreement, just truth laid flat between them. The man gave a slight nod, as if that answer fit into a place he had already prepared. Then he stepped closer, closing the space by a few inches, enough to make the paper more than just an object, enough to make it a choice. "This land," he said quietly, glancing past Ethan toward the stretch of dry earth and worn fencing, "has a long history of being misunderstood." Ethan's eyes narrowed just a fraction, because that was not how men like this spoke about land. Not unless they were trying to say something without saying it fully. The man's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the paper, not enough to crease it, just enough to remind anyone watching that it belonged to him. "Records," he went on, "have a way of correcting those misunderstandings." And there it was, not loud, not sharp, but clear, the kind of clarity that settles into the bones rather than striking the ears. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath carrying years with it. Nights spent staring at walls that did not feel like his. Days working soil that answered to someone else's name. He had seen papers like that before, signed them, ignored them, fought them in his own quiet ways. And still they had come. Always they had come. The man watched him carefully, not like an enemy, not like a friend, but like a man observing a result he had already calculated. Then he did something small, almost unnoticeable. He tilted the paper just enough for the light to catch the writing, and Ethan saw it then, his own name, clear, undeniable, etched into the center like it had always been there waiting, and beneath it, the mark that tied it all together, the one that made everything else fall into place. Ethan did not move, did not speak, because movement would have meant something, and he was not ready to give that yet. The man lowered the paper slightly, eyes still fixed on him. And for the first time since morning broke, there was something different in his expression, not softness, not weakness, but something closer to consideration. "Tell me, Mr. Cole," he said, voice quieter now, almost thoughtful, "when you pulled me from that road, did you think about what I might cost you?" The question hung there, not demanding, not urgent, just present, and Ethan stood in the middle of it, the land behind him, the riders ahead, the paper between, and somewhere deep inside, something old and steady held its ground, not against the man, not against the riders, but against the idea that everything could be reduced to a line on a page. He looked at the paper once more, then back at the man, and when he spoke, his voice did not rise, did not harden, it simply existed. "No," he said, and the word carried more weight than any argument ever could, because it was not just an answer, It was a line drawn where no paper could reach. The word hung in the air longer than it should have. Simple, quiet, but it did not bend. It did not soften. It stayed where Ethan Cole placed it. And for a moment, nothing followed. Not the wind, not the riders, not even the man holding the paper. Silence settled deeper instead, like the land itself was listening. The man studied Ethan with a different kind of attention now, not the distant measure from before, but something closer, something that weighed more than appearances. His fingers loosened slightly on the edge of the document, not enough to drop it, just enough to let it breathe. And then he nodded once, slow, as if confirming something only he understood. No, he repeated under his breath, almost thoughtful, as though the answer carried a meaning beyond the word itself. Behind him, one of the riders shifted in the saddle, just a fraction, leather creaking softly, but no one spoke. No one interrupted, because whatever was happening here did not belong to them. It belonged to the two men standing 10 feet apart with a lifetime folded between them. The man glanced down at the paper again, then back up, the morning light catching his eyes in a way that made them seem colder, clearer, less human than before. Most men would have looked first, he said quietly. At the satchel, at the coat, at the road I came from. His gaze moved briefly toward the cabin door, toward the place where he had lain the night before, vulnerable in a way that now felt almost impossible. Most men would have asked what I carried before deciding whether I was worth the trouble. Ethan did not answer, because he knew it was true. He had seen it enough times, men weighing others like coin, deciding worth before action, but that was never the road he walked, not anymore. The man stepped closer again, closing the distance just enough that the paper now cast a faint shadow across Ethan's chest. You did not, he said, and this time, there was something else in his voice, not warmth, not kindness, but something that did not belong to calculation either, something unfamiliar. You chose first. The wind moved again, brushing past them, carrying the dry scent of earth and old wood. Ethan's eyes stayed steady, not challenging, not yielding, just present. Out here, he said slowly. You do what you can when it is in front of you. It was not a defense, not an explanation, just the shape of a belief worn smooth over time. The man considered that, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he looked past Ethan again, across the land that stretched quiet and worn under the rising sun. Fences leaning slightly where the ground had shifted over the years, patches of soil that had given more than they had received. And something in his posture changed, subtle, but real, like a man seeing a place not just as numbers, but as something that had been lived in. This property, he said, after a pause, voice lower now, has been accounted for many times. The words were careful, deliberate, chosen with the precision of someone used to being understood without saying everything. But it has not always been understood. Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly, not at the words themselves, but at the weight behind them. He had heard men speak like this before, men who never stayed long enough to see what their words did, men who turned land into lines and lives into figures. But this one stood here now, boots in the same dust, breathing the same dry air, and that made something different. The man lifted the paper again, holding it up between them, not as a threat, not as a shield, but as a fact that could not be undone. Legally, he continued, this land is not yours. The sentence landed without force, without edge, but it did not need either, because truth spoken that way does not strike. It settles. The riders remained still, their presence pressing quietly at the edges of the moment, witnesses without voice. Ethan let the words sit, did not react, did not deny, because denying something like that would have been like denying the sky above him. Instead, he looked at the paper, then at the man, and then past him, to the land that had held him when nothing else did. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something deeper than defiance, something steadier than anger. It is where I stayed, he said, simple, unadorned, and in that moment, the difference between ownership and belonging stood clear without needing to be named. The man's eyes shifted slightly at that, not surprised, but attentive, like he had been waiting for that exact answer. He lowered the paper just a fraction, enough to break the line between them. And for the first time since the riders arrived, the tension did not rise. It changed, something quieter, something heavier, something that did not move forward or back. but inward. The man drew a slow breath, then looked down at the document once more, his thumb brushing lightly over the seal as if feeling its weight. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, still controlled, still precise, but no longer distant. "Then perhaps," he said carefully, "we have both been standing in the wrong place for longer than we realized." And the words did not close anything, did not resolve anything. They opened something instead. Something that had not been there before. Something that neither paper nor silence could fully hold. The words did not settle easily. They lingered, stretching thin across the space between them like something unfinished. And for the first time since morning broke, the man did not speak right away. He looked past Ethan again, but not at the land this time, not at the fences or the dry patches of soil. His gaze drifted toward the cabin door, toward the quiet place where he had spent the night. And something in his expression shifted, not enough for most men to notice. But Ethan had spent years reading what was not said. The man turned slowly and walked back toward the porch, each step measured, deliberate, like he was retracing something invisible. The riders did not follow, did not question. They remained where they were, still as markers in the distance. Their silence no longer just presence, but permission. The man stepped inside the cabin without invitation, not out of disrespect, but out of certainty. And for a brief moment, Ethan stood alone on the porch, the morning stretching around him, wide and quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before something changes. He did not rush, did not call after him. Instead, he turned and followed, boots steady against the worn wood. Inside, the air had not changed, still carrying the faint scent of smoke and old timber. The same dim light touching the same narrow cot where the man had rested, but now it felt different, like a place that had been seen in a new way. The man moved to the table where the leather satchel still lay, untouched since the night before. He placed the paper beside it, careful, almost respectful, then rested his hand lightly on the satchel, as if confirming it was still there, still real. "You did not open it," he said, not turning, his voice low, more observation than question. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, arms loose at his sides. "Was not mine to open," he replied, simple, direct. The man nodded slowly, fingers brushing over the worn leather, tracing its edges like someone familiar with its weight. "Most would have," he said, and there was no judgment in it, just fact. "Most would have looked for a reason to help themselves before helping me." He lifted the satchel slightly, then set it back down, the sound soft but final. "There is more in here than money," he added quietly, and for a moment, his hand remained there, still, as if whatever it held carried something beyond value. Ethan did not move closer, did not ask what it contained, because he already understood that whatever was inside had brought those riders to his door, had crossed miles of open land to find its way back to this man. The man turned then, leaning lightly against the table, arms resting at his sides, his posture no longer guarded, but not relaxed either, something in between, something considering. "Do you know what happens to men who fall behind on payments in places like this?" he asked, his tone even, not threatening, not soft, just clear. Ethan's gaze held steady. "They lose what they cannot hold on to," he said, and the words carried no bitterness, no edge, just truth worn smooth by time. The man studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "That is one way of seeing it," he replied. Then he glanced back at the paper on the table, the one that carried Ethan's name, the one that tied this place to something beyond his hands. "Another way," he continued, "is that they lose what was never truly given to them in the first place." The sentence settled into the room like dust, quiet but impossible to ignore. Ethan's eyes flicked briefly to the paper, then away, because he had heard that version before too, spoken by men who never stayed long enough to see the cost. But this time, it felt different, not because the words had changed, but because the man speaking them had slept under his roof, had breathed the same air, had seen the inside of this place not as a number, but as something lived in. The man pushed himself off the table slowly, stepping closer, not invading, not retreating, just closing the distance enough to make the next words matter. "Last night," he said, his voice lower now, quieter, "you chose not to ask who I was." Ethan did not respond, because the answer was already there, in the silence between them. You chose not to ask what I carried, the man continued, his eyes steady, searching not for guilt, but for something else, something harder to name. You chose to act before you understood. He paused then, letting that settle, letting it find its place, and when he spoke again, the words came slower, more deliberate. That is not how men in my world operate. Ethan let out a quiet breath, not frustration, not agreement, just release. Maybe that is why I do not live in your world, he said, and there was no challenge in it, just distance. The kind that cannot be crossed by paper or law. The man's expression shifted again, subtle, thoughtful, and for the first time, the space between them did not feel like opposition. It felt like a question, one that had not yet been asked. Outside, a faint movement stirred among the riders, not impatience, not pressure, just time continuing as it always did. And inside that small cabin, two men stood with something unspoken building between them, something that neither numbers nor silence could fully contain, something that had begun the moment one chose to stop on a road where most would have kept riding. The silence between them did not break. It deepened, like something settling into place that neither man had expected, but both understood in their own way. The man's eyes lingered on Ethan a moment longer, not searching now, not measuring, just holding, as if the answer he had been waiting for had already been given without words. Then he turned slightly, his attention shifting back to the table, to the paper, to the satchel, to the small pieces that had carried so much weight into this room. He reached for the document again, lifting it slowly, his thumb brushing once more over the seal. But this time there was hesitation, not doubt, not uncertainty, just pause, the kind that comes when a man realizes the next step will not follow the path he has always walked. Outside, a horse shifted its weight, the soft scrape of a hoof against dry earth drifting faintly through the open doorway, a reminder that time had not stopped, that decision still carried consequences beyond these walls. The man exhaled quietly, almost to himself, then looked back at Ethan. Do you know how many of these I have signed? He asked, holding the paper up slightly, not to show it, but to acknowledge it. Ethan did not answer, because the number did not matter, the weight did. The man gave a faint nod as if accepting that silence as the only correct response. Enough that I stopped seeing the names, he continued, voice low, steady. Enough that they became numbers before they became people. The words did not carry pride. They did not carry apology either. They simply existed, plain and unguarded. And that alone made them heavier than anything spoken before. Ethan's gaze did not shift, but something behind it did, something quiet, something that recognized truth when it stood in front of him. Even if it came from a place he did not trust. The man lowered the paper slightly, his fingers loosening just enough to crease one edge, a small imperfection that did not belong to him, and he noticed it, his eyes flicking to it briefly, as if even that small change meant something. Last night, he said again, softer now, you did not see a number. Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly, not in resistance, but in acknowledgement, because that part was true. You saw a man who needed help. The man continued, and for the first time, there was something in his voice that did not belong to control, something closer to reflection. He stepped toward the door, stopping just short of the threshold, where the light from outside met the dim interior. The riders were still there, unmoved, unchanged, waiting not for orders, but for resolution. The man looked at them briefly, then back at Ethan, and something in that glance said more than words. It said he could walk out, could hand over the paper, could let the world continue exactly as it always had, and no one would question it. No one would stop him. That was the power he carried, quiet, absolute, unquestioned. He turned back fully, facing Ethan again, and for a moment, neither spoke, the air between them thick with everything that had not been said, everything that could not be undone. Then the man did something small, almost unremarkable. He folded the paper once, carefully, along a line that had been pressed many times before, but instead of placing it back into his coat, instead of returning it to the place where decisions were stored and forgotten, he held it in his hand, still, waiting. Ethan watched him, not expecting anything, not hoping for anything, because hope had never been a tool he relied on. The man's fingers tightened slightly around the folded document, then loosened again, like he was testing the weight of it one last time. In my world, he said quietly. This would be simple. He glanced toward the writers again, then back. The paper speaks, and everything else follows. He paused, and when he continued, his voice had changed, not louder, not softer, just different. But out here, his eyes moved briefly around the cabin, the worn walls, the simple table, the place where he had been given water without question. It seems the order is not always the same. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the floor creaking under his boot, the only sound in the room, but he did not speak. Because this moment did not belong to him to shape. It belonged to the man holding the paper, the man who had arrived with everything already decided, the man who now stood on the edge of something he had never had to consider before. Outside, the wind picked up just enough to stir the dust along the road, a soft movement, barely there, but enough to remind them both that nothing stays still for long. The man looked down at the folded document one last time, then back at Ethan, and in that look, something shifted, something that could not be undone once it moved. You said you did not think about what I might cost you, he said slowly. Perhaps that is why I must now consider what you have cost me. The words did not carry threat. They did not carry warning. They carried something else, something quieter, something heavier, and without another word, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them, the paper still in his hand, the decision still unspoken, but no longer untouched. The space between them closed without a sound, not like a step, not like a movement, but like something inevitable finally reaching its end. The man stood close enough now that the paper in his hand was no longer just an object between them. It was a decision waiting to be made. His eyes did not leave Ethan's, not searching, not testing, just steady, like he had already walked through every possible outcome and found only one that remained. Outside, the riders still waited, unmoving, their patience no longer just discipline, but trust, the kind given to a man whose decisions were never questioned, and that made what followed matter even more. The man lifted the folded document slightly, turning it once in his hand as if feeling its edges for the last time. Then he spoke, his voice lower than before, quieter, but carrying farther than anything he had said yet. There are men who spend their lives building power, he said, his gaze steady. And there are men who never seek it, yet carry something stronger without knowing. Ethan did not respond, because he understood that this was not a conversation anymore. It was something else, something closer to truth being laid bare without the need to defend it. The man glanced briefly toward the door, toward the riders, then back again. Where I come from, he continued. This paper would decide everything. He lifted it slightly, just enough to let the light touch its surface. It would take this land, your work, your time, and it would do so without hesitation. He paused, letting the weight of that settle fully, not as threat, not as warning, but as fact. Then his hand lowered slowly. The paper no longer held up between them, but down at his side. But last night, he said, and there it was again, that shift in his voice, that quiet change that had begun the moment Ethan chose to stop on that road. Last night, something else decided. The words did not come fast. They came measured, each one placed with care. You chose to act before you understood. He repeated, not as accusation, but as recognition. And in doing so, you changed the order of things. Ethan's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in confusion, but in focus, because he could feel where this was going. Even if he did not yet see its shape, the man took one final breath, slow, deliberate, then did something that none of the riders outside expected, something that did not belong to the world he came from. His fingers tightened around the folded document, and then, without force, without drama, he began to tear it, not in anger, not in defiance, but in quiet certainty. The sound was soft, almost lost beneath the wind outside, but it carried more weight than any gunshot ever could. Ethan did not move, did not speak, his eyes fixed on the man as the paper separated in his hands, once, then again, until what had once held power over everything in front of them was reduced to pieces that no longer meant anything at all. The man let them fall, not scattering, not thrown, just released, the fragments drifting slowly to the wooden floor between them. And for a moment, no one moved, not inside, not outside. The The riders remained still, but something in their stillness had changed, not confusion, not resistance, but understanding. The kind that comes when a line has been crossed that cannot be uncrossed. The man looked down at the torn pieces for a brief second, then back at Ethan, and there was no calculation left in his expression now, no distance, just clarity. "You said you did not think about what I might cost you," he said quietly, and now the words carried something different, something that did not belong to debt or ownership. "Now I understand what you gave instead." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not from emotion, but from the weight of what had just happened, because he knew this was not just about him, not just about land or paper. It was about a man who had stepped outside of everything he had been, if only for a moment. The man turned then, walking toward the door, each step steady, unhurried, as if nothing behind him needed to be revisited, as if the decision had already settled fully. He stepped out into the morning light, the riders watching him now, not waiting, not questioning, just observing. He paused at the edge of the porch, then looked back once, not long, not searching, just enough to mark the moment. "We are even," he said, simple, final, not as a transaction, but as something deeper, something that did not need to be written down to be real. Then he stepped forward, mounting his horse without another word, the riders turning with him as one, their movement quiet, controlled, and within seconds, they were already riding away, the dust rising behind them, the sound of hooves fading into the distance, leaving nothing behind but silence, and a few torn pieces of paper on a wooden floor, and Ethan Cole standing exactly where he had been, but no longer the same man who had stood there before. The dust did not settle right away. It lingered in the air long after the riders had disappeared beyond the ridge, like something unwilling to leave completely, and Ethan Cole stood on the porch without moving, eyes fixed on the empty stretch of land where they had been just moments before. The silence that followed was not the same silence from before. It was heavier now, fuller, like the land itself had witnessed something it did not often see and was still deciding what to do with it. The wind moved slow across the dry grass, brushing against the fence posts, slipping through the cracks in the wood, carrying with it the faint echo of hoofbeats that no longer existed. Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, his shoulders easing just slightly, not in relief, not in victory, but in something quieter, something harder to name. He turned at last and stepped back inside the cabin, the floor creaking under his weight, the same familiar sound that had followed him for years, but now it felt different, like it belonged to a place that had just been returned to him in a way no paper ever could. The pieces of the torn document still lay scattered across the wooden boards, unmoving, their edges curled slightly where they had landed, no longer carrying meaning, no longer carrying power, just fragments of something that had once held control over everything in this room. Ethan crouched slowly, his hand hovering over them for a moment before he picked one up. The paper felt lighter than he expected, almost empty, like whatever had given it weight had already been taken away. He turned it between his fingers, the ink still clear, his name still visible on one edge, but it did not feel the same. It did not press against him the way it had before. He let it fall back to the floor without a second thought, rising again with a quiet breath, his eyes drifting to the table where the leather satchel still rested, untouched, just as it had been the night before. The object that had crossed miles, drawn riders, carried a man back to his own doorstep. Ethan stepped closer, not with urgency, not with curiosity, but with something steadier, something that had changed without him noticing when it happened. He placed his hand lightly on the worn leather, feeling its surface, the texture of it, the weight beneath. It was still not his, that had not changed, but something about the distance between him and it had. He did not open it, did not move it, just let his hand rest there for a moment before pulling it back. Outside, the wind picked up again, a little stronger now, pushing through the open doorway, lifting one of the torn fragments just enough to slide it across the floor a few inches before letting it settle again. And in that small movement, something shifted, not in the room, but in Ethan. He stepped back toward the doorway, looking out across the land once more. The fences still stood, worn but steady, the ground still dry, still demanding. Nothing about the place had changed, and yet everything had. Because for the first time in years, there was nothing hanging over it, nothing waiting to be claimed or taken, no unseen hand holding it in place. Just the land and the man standing on it, the way it had always been meant to be. Ethan adjusted his hat slightly, the motion slow, familiar, then stepped down from the porch, boots meeting the dirt with a quiet firmness. He walked a few steps out, stopping where the wagon tracks still marked the ground, faint but visible, the same place where it had all begun, where a man had been left behind and another had chosen to stop. He looked down at the tracks for a moment, then out toward the horizon, where the riders had vanished. And for the first time, there was no question in his mind about what had happened. No doubt, no second guessing, just understanding, simple and clear. He turned back toward the cabin, the door still open, the pieces of paper still scattered inside, and the satchel still waiting on the table, untouched. He paused for a brief second, then stepped inside again, not to close the door, not to gather the fragments, but simply to stand there, in the middle of it all. And in that stillness, something settled fully, something that did not need to be spoken, did not need to be written, because out here, the things that mattered most were never the ones that ended up on paper, they were the ones that stayed. Long after everything else had been torn apart and carried away, the day moved on the way it always did, slow and certain, the sun climbing higher until the shadows shortened and the heat settled across the land like a quiet weight. And yet nothing felt the same. Ethan Cole worked without thinking, hands moving through familiar motions, checking the fence line, tightening a loose post, running his palm along the worn wood as if confirming it was still there, still real. But every now and then, his eyes would drift back toward the cabin, toward the open door he had not closed, toward the place where something had shifted without leaving a mark. The wind carried dust across the yard in soft trails, erasing the last faint signs of the riders who had come and gone like they belonged to another world entirely. By midday, the silence had settled again, not empty, not hollow, but full in a way it had never been before, like the land itself had exhaled. And Ethan felt it in the way he stood, in the way his shoulders rested without that quiet pressure that had followed him for years. He walked back toward the cabin as the lights softened slightly, the sky stretching wide and clear above him. And for a moment, he paused at the doorway, looking inside as if seeing it for the first time. The torn pieces of paper still lay scattered across the floor, unmoved except for the ones the wind had nudged earlier, and the satchel remained on the table, exactly where it had been left, untouched, waiting in a way that did not demand anything. Ethan stepped inside slowly, boots pressing into the same boards that had carried him through every season. And he stood there, letting the quiet settle around him once more. His gaze moved from the fragments on the floor to the satchel, and this time, he did not look away. He crossed the room with steady steps, stopping at the table, his hand resting on the worn leather again. But this time, there was no hesitation, no distance, just a quiet understanding that whatever this was, it had been left here for a reason. He opened it slowly, not out of curiosity, not out of need, but because the moment called for it. The leather gave with a soft sound, and inside, there were no stacks of money, no gold, nothing that would change a man's life in the way most people imagine. Instead, there were papers, carefully folded, sealed, marked with the same precision as the one that had been torn apart. Ethan lifted one, unfolding it just enough to see the writing, names, lines, records, not just his, but others, many others, scattered across miles of land, tied together by the same hand, the same system that had once held him in place. He let out a slow breath, not in surprise, but in recognition. This was the weight the man had carried, not just wealth, but control, responsibility, decisions that reached farther than one piece of land. Ethan set the paper back down gently, closing the satchel without taking anything, because he understood now that what had been given to him was not something to be claimed, it was something to be seen. He stepped back, his eyes lingering on the table for a moment longer before turning away. Outside, the light had begun to shift again, the long stretch of afternoon moving toward evening, the wind easing into something softer, something that carried less dust and more stillness. Ethan walked out onto the porch, stopping at the edge where the boards met the dirt, and he looked out across the land once more, the same land that had held him through every season, every loss, every quiet fight he had never spoken about. And for the first time, there was nothing pulling against it, nothing unseen waiting to take it away, just space, open and honest. The way it should have been all along. He adjusted his hat slightly, the motion slow, thoughtful, and then he sat down on the edge of the porch, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the horizon where the riders had disappeared hours before. And in that stillness, the truth settled in a way that did not need words. Out here, nothing was ever truly owned. Not land, not time, not even the moments that changed everything. They were borrowed, held for a while, shaped by the choices a man made when no one was watching. Ethan let out a quiet breath, the sound almost lost to the wind, and as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the ground, the cabin behind him stood open, the satchels still resting inside, the pieces of paper still scattered across the floor, and somewhere far beyond the ridge, a man who had once held everything in his hands rode on without it. And Ethan Cole remained where he had always been, not richer, not poorer, just different in a way no one could measure. Because out here, the only things that ever truly stayed were the ones a man chose to leave behind.